Uh, this is also our last session on the book of Amos. So there are some people in Hong Kong, very elderly people that I knew when I lived there, who are unable to get onto Zoom. So I've been sending them the link every week, and they seem to be really enjoying. They watch the videos more than once during the week. We come to the final 3 chapters. These chapters are bound together structurally. We've seen this over and over. We'll have a look at it again. Somebody titled these chapters as God's roar for justice and mercy. And, so I put this up just for comparison's sake. Now, in these 3 chapters, what we have are 5 visions. Okay, a vision of locusts, fire, a plumb line. Then we have a parenthesis encounter between make-believe high priest, not in Jerusalem, Amaziah and Amos. And then we have a fruit basket vision, very unusual. And then the vision of the altar. And final epilogue. In the epilogue, we meet the expression Yahweh says 4 times, but more importantly, we would meet 5 promises. And so it sort of balances itself, the 5 visions versus the 5 promises. The whole book ends with this expression, Yahweh, our God, your God, says. This is so important to Amos, and we will see in the encounter with Amaziah why this is so important to Amos, maybe even more than other prophets. He used in a very short book, he used this expression so frequently. It's like the need to validate himself nonstop, so to speak. So let's look at the first vision, which is the vision about the locust. The vision begins with this expression, as most of these 5 visions would. Adonai Yahweh showed me two different names blended together. He is the one who blends these names the most often, more of them blended together than almost any other writer. So Adonai is the normal replacement word for Yahweh himself, but he's put them together. Almost impossible to translate because in the English Bible, both names are translated as Lord. And if you look at the modern translations, Yahweh has all caps and Adonai only L is capitalized. But you can't say Lord, Lord. And so most of them have tried to create a new name with a combination. So I'm just leaving you with the Hebrew because we know the word Adonai and we know the name Yahweh. Adonai Yahweh showed me. This is an important linguistic element to speak about vision. Visions are things that they see. And see is not just the sense of sight, but it's also the fact that see means they can experience the vision. And this is the most important part of any vision. And so he says, wait a minute, let me change my, okay. He doesn't just say that he showed me, he describes a locust swarm that God sent to devastate the land. Now, in Thailand, this has never been a problem, but in the Middle East, this is a recurring problem. Same with East Africa and Northern Africa. These swarms of locusts, they are voracious. I have not seen a swarm of locusts here in Thailand, but I did see some insects on one of my small bushes outside. Very nice little bush with beautiful white flowers, and these insects appeared one night out of nowhere. They are kind of caterpillar, and in one night they ate up every single leaf on the bush. It took months for the bush to recover. I had to get some insecticide to spray them. It was hard to get rid of them. Extrapolate that to an entire swarm of locusts. You can imagine what happened. Amos pleads for forgiveness. When he saw this, he asked God to not carry through with this. Now, seeing the vision doesn't mean it has yet happened. That's why he's able to plead for forgiveness, asking God to please hold his hand. And then we are told, and this is unusual, that God relents. So God says, all right, I will not do it. This is quite the opposite of the plagues in Egypt, where God's relenting happens after the plague. The Pharaoh challenges God, and God sends the locusts in Egypt. And only when the Pharaoh says, please ask God to take it away, then Moses would pray and the swarm would disappear. In this case, it never happened. So the vision is a vision of potential judgment, but using language that the Israelites would understand, since they experience, well, if not this generation, but in their national history, they experienced the locust plague in Egypt. And they heard the stories of how those locusts ate up everything green in the land of Egypt. So this vision is relatively short and has these four elements. And these four elements tend to repeat in most of these visions. So there is the identification of what God shows. There is the identification of some kind of punitive judgment, potential punitive judgment. There is a begging for mercy on the part of the prophet, and then this relenting of God. The King James Bible translated this concept as God repented. And in today's English, this creates an awful idea. And so most modern translations have changed the language. God relents. Think of it like God changing his mind. He says, this is what I want to do, but since you're begging for forgiveness, okay, I will not do that. I will give you another chance. So it's more about God giving another chance to the nation of Israel. The second vision is more terrifying because this was a vision that reflects their own experience in the desert, not so much what happened in Egypt. And again, it begins with the same formula. Adonai Yahweh showed me. Now imagine being a prophet, even though this is visionary language, he sees this massive, think of it like a wildfire, a forest fire, like the kind we've been watching on television in California, in Australia, a fire that's totally out of control. Now, of course, if you are an Israelite, a Jew at the time of Amos, you would think of events like Moses seeing God in that bush of fire that did not consume the bush but flared up. You would think of the Mount Carmel experience where Elijah brought fire from heaven, fire that was so intense it burned up the rocks and evaporated all the water. So they did have experiences. You would also probably remember the fire that came on the altar at the dedication of Solomon's temple. And so fire was an important part of their lives. They also knew that fire was one of the three primary cleansing agents in the temple. There was blood, there was water, there was fire. In the Bible, we see these cleansing agents being used by God. Water with the flood of Noah, the blood with the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, and then fire with the final lake of fire, the total extermination of sin. They probably remember stories from Genesis of the fire that consumed Sodom and Gomorrah. So fire is either a cleansing agent, brings about something new, or it is a destructive agent. So Sodom and Gomorrah on the one hand, the dedication of the temple on the other. So he sees this great fire that God says will devour the land. Now, if the land has been devoured by the locusts, the fire would burn everything up. So no more leaves. So even the stem, the branches, the roots, the buildings, the houses, everything would burn up. And Amos jumps right up and pleads for forgiveness. Now, this is quite interesting because when Habakkuk, a little bit later than Amos, pleaded with God to hold his hand and not to punish them, God says no. He will carry on with the punishment. When Jeremiah attempts to stall the visions about the judgment, the coming exile by telling God he doesn't want to carry it through. God puts fire inside Jeremiah, so he would have to preach his vision. So we would consider Amos, at least in these first 2-3 visions, as having an unusual kind of success, being able to hold back, because in this one too, it says that God relents. All right, God says, I will not do that either. So I will not send the locusts, I will not send the fire. So there is no judgment recorded of this kind of massive swarm of locusts or this massive wildfire destroying the land of Israel. At the most, this would probably refer to the fire of those big cities being burned by the Assyrian invasion or by the Babylonian invasion, but not the entire land, as the vision seems to imply. Vision number 3 is dealing with an architectural or constructor's tool that we don't use anymore in the modern world. Here, he doesn't use Adonai Yahweh. He just simply says, he showed me, because the use of the name twice is enough. And so he says, he showed me. That means that Adonai Yahweh showed him. This time, Adonai, he says, is standing by a wall holding a plumb line. Now, in the old days, they used this because it's a heavy weight at the bottom and a rope hanging down to see if a wall is vertically straight. I was in Sarawak many, many years ago. And so they were building a church and they were doing it manually. Church members came together, pastors came together, building a church in a small village, in one of the villages, one of what in Malay they call the kampongs in Sarawak. So I went with the group one day. I was teaching an extension school there. So the pastor said, come with us. Let's go and see this building being built. They had different crews working. And the day that I went there, they were building the walls. Okay. And I saw a very unusual sight. One crew was building one wall on one side and a different crew on the other side. The crew that was building first wall, they apparently were experienced builder. They knew exactly what to do. So their bricks came up in straight lines, everything, the bricks, the mortars in between. The other group was not so experienced. And believe it or not, the bricks actually had a bit of a wave and the wall was not fully vertical. You could even see with your eyes that it was not straight. And so I called the pastor who was leading the project. I said, can you see what's happening in this church? One wall is going straight up. The bricks are going straight across. This other wall, the bricks are waving and the wall is not exactly perpendicular. So the plumb line is a measurement of whether things are right. This is a metaphor for God measuring his people. The plumb line could be a metaphor of the law or the Torah. Are you in line with these instructions? And now, much later, Josiah, when they discovered during his kingship, his reign, a copy of the Torah, he realized that they were like that wavy wall. So I told them, you're going to have a problem with this church. And his answer was very cute. He said, don't worry, Dr. Fanwar, we'll plaster everything up and nobody will see the wavy brick lines. But I thought it was really, really, really funny. I don't know if that church is still standing or if it had any problems architecturally later on or not. But the plumb line ensures that such a building project does not happen. I'm watching Muban being built right next to the one to my present village. It's right behind our wall. In fact, their wall has been raised. It's right next to our back wall. It's been raised higher than the first floor. So now our houses are very dark because all the windows at the back, no more light is coming through. But I've been watching them and bit by bit. These days, they use a lot of mechanized machines, tractors and pounders and everything, including sinking these pylons straight down with a simple little hydraulic machine that just pushes them. They don't even dig a hole, just pushes them through the soil into the bedrock. And everything looks very straight. All the pillars all the pylons are in straight lines. The wall is quite in straight line. They haven't plastered the side facing my back walls. When I see through the window, I can see a very rough wall, but it's straight up. And so God is measuring his people. This is very clear. And in this vision, Amos does nothing because there's nothing to plead. The wall is either straight or it's not straight, and he cannot ask anything more. And then God says this: I will test my people with this plumb line. Is the wall going straight up, or is the wall waving a little bit? And then he adds, I will no longer ignore their sins, all their sins. The plumb line vision conveys the idea that God had reached a saturation point. He has tolerated the sins of Israel since they left Egypt until the time of Amos. So they left Egypt around 1450 BC. Amos lived around 750, or he did his preaching around 750 BC. We are talking here about almost 1,000 years of history. They have never been straight. Their spiritual wall was always leaning, always zigzag. The bricks never lined up properly. And so God says, enough is enough. I will no longer ignore. I cannot ignore anymore. And you will find this message in all the 8th century prophets, in Hosea, in Joel, obviously in Amos, in Isaiah, in Micah. All the prophets of that period have the same message repeated in so many different ways, that there is a point where God says, no more sin. I will no longer tolerate. This is when his people reach that breaking point, when they almost slip between being God's people to becoming, using a Hebrew term, herem, that means devoted to destruction. And God will not allow his people to fall into that pit of sin. After this vision, we have this encounter between the prophet and this Amaziah guy. Now, we are told that Amaziah was a priest at Bethel. Now, remember that when Jeroboam broke off from the house of Solomon, one of the first things he did was to establish his own temple and his own religion, and to drive out all the priests and Levites into the smaller kingdom of Judah. And so he established his own parallel priesthood. He prevented his people from going to Jerusalem. I'm sure many of them still found a way to go there, but at least officially they were not allowed to go to Jerusalem. And so Amaziah considered himself the high priest at Bethel. Bethel is one of those places where the tabernacle of Moses rested for a number of years. When they settled into the land, before Solomon built the temple, the tabernacle moved from place to place. Bethel was one of them. And so they considered it a holy place and eventually built an Israelite temple, if you like, to counter the one in Jerusalem. He accused Amos of treason and attempting to overthrow King Jeroboam too. Now, if you recall our introductory lesson, Jeroboam too lived about the same time as Uzziah, the king of Judah. And between the two of them, Israel and Judah reached the apex of their development. When you combine the territory, the achievements of these two kings, they raised these two nations to the level of Solomon's kingdom. And so Jeroboam he ruled for quite a long time, and he was a really great king from a political sense. Didn't worship Yahweh, like none of the kings of Israel worship Yahweh anymore. But politically, militarily, economically, he was truly, truly successful king. This was the golden period. And so here's a prophet who's from Judah, comes into Israel, and he's preaching these prophecies of judgment. And so Amaziah takes it upon himself to correct the priest. But he does that by accusing him of treason. He says, you are here to overthrow How can one prophet overthrow Jeroboam too? About 100 years later, another prophet, but this time in Judah, faced the similar situation. When Jeremiah was chosen by God to be the prophet, his main message is surrender yourself to the Babylonians. And the kings of Judah saw Jeremiah as a traitor. They tried to kill him over and over, but God had prophesied that Jeremiah would be die-proof. So no matter what they did, they could not kill Jeremiah. Can you imagine living that way? You know, you cannot die no matter how much suffering you have because God says you will not die. So here are two prophets, one with the northern kingdom, one with the southern kingdom, who are accused of treason. You know, if you are a prophet of God in today's world and you speak to any government and ask them to change or to surrender to a foreign power, you will be accused of treason. You will be executed. You will be put in the gulag, or depends what country you're in. In 1979, I went with a group of singers to the Andaman Islands, to Port Blair. And we went there to see a prison house. In Port Blair used to be the prison house of the British. This is where they would send the worst criminals from India to that prison. It was called Kalapani. Okay, you all know what that means. And it was an awful prison. Yes, now it's become a kind of a museum sort of place, but it was a terrible place. You can just imagine the conditions that those prisoners lived in. Okay, these were some of the people sent there were the political protesters against British rule. Some of them were just out and out horrible criminals. And they tried. Amaziah was, I think, hoping that he can have Amos arrested and put in prison. But when that didn't work, I think Jeroboam too didn't really buy into the arrest idea. He then takes it upon himself to order Amos to return to Judah. He says, go there, go back to your country, go and prophesy there. Why come to us? Jonah did not run away because he was afraid to go to Nineveh. He ran away because he disagreed with God. Why should I go to Nineveh, to Assyria, who were enemies? Jonah lived about the same time as Amos, maybe a little bit earlier. They are the enemy. Eventually, they are the ones who would destroy the northern kingdom. Why should I go and preach to them? When Jonah boarded that ship to Spain, his intention was not driven by fear or by trying to get away from God. His intention was defiance of the mission of God. No, I cannot do this mission. I am a prophet, but I will not go and preach to Nineveh. We know that he never agreed with God because even when he finally ended up in Nineveh and he preached, and we are told very satirically that everyone and every animal in Nineveh repented, Jeremiah refuses to accept their repentance. Jonah refuses to accept their repentance. Do you know that Jesus speaks about the sign of Jonah as the sign that the people of his days would be like Nineveh? They would not accept the gospel. And so these prophets had really difficult situations. So how does Amos respond? Well, he states his commission. I'm not a professional prophet. The Hebrew expression, I'm not a prophet or son of a prophet. I was never trained to be one. I'm just a shepherd. I take care of sycamore fig trees. We covered all this. He said, I'm just a businessman. I'm just a shepherd. Shepherd here, the word here actually means owner of flocks of sheep. He says, I'm not a religious person. I did not go to seminary. I'm not theological. I'm just a lay person, a business person. But it was God who called me. I'm commissioned by God himself. He says, but the Lord called me away from my flock and told me, go and prophesy to my people in Israel. So go away from Judah go up there to Samaria and preach to Israel. This was another common thing in the lives of the prophets. They did not have the option to disobey the commission. Neither Jonah, even though he tried to run away, nor Amos, who was challenged for being a traitor from another country, nor Isaiah, nor Jeremiah, who didn't want to preach, nor Moses, who didn't want to go back to Egypt. No prophet was given a choice. Because here's the catch. If God chose a man to be a prophet, but he refuses the commission, he could lose his salvation in the process. And so God goes out of his way to ensure that the prophets did not undergo that experience. So to save the prophet from losing his salvation, God compels them to carry out the commission. You know, there have been many theology graduates who join theological programs because they believe God is calling them to ministry. And then somewhere along the way, they discover, hey, wait, all this preaching thing and this pastoral care thing and this evangelism thing, this is not my cup of tea, and they walk away from it. And here's the difficulty. You cannot walk away from the commission of God. If you do, and you believed that God had called you, you jeopardize your salvation. If you join a theology program, seminary training, but you didn't really believe that, you just went with some emotional response to maybe a week of prayer or whatever, then I think God overlooks that. But if you go in with the conviction that you are called, you're chosen by God to speak on his behalf, and then you walk away from that. You see, in the Bible, you don't have that happening. You can have business people who become prophets, like Amos, but you don't have prophets who become business people. Balaam was a prophet who tried to exchange business for prophecy. And you know what nearly happened to Balaam. Eventually, God had to control his mouth literally so that he would not actually be lost in the final sense. People who are called to serve God in full-time ministry need to be very careful that they are absolutely certain that this is a commission from God. And if it is commission from God, you do not have the option of silence. You have to carry it out. And then he reiterates his message. People of Israel will certainly become captives in exile far from their homeland. Can you imagine? You are not an Israel citizen, you are from Judah, you are in a foreign nation, so to speak. Think of it like the North Korea, South Korea situation. Okay, and the Israelites were enemies of Judah. Of course, now they're facing the greater enemy of Assyria, and you tell them you're going to be taken captives and you'll be taken far, far away from home. Now we know that the Assyrians, unlike the Babylonians, they scattered the 10 tribes all over their kingdom. The Babylonians did not do that. They took Judah and settled them in one particular location in Babylon, the river Kebar. So this is very different. The two captivities are very different from each other. And this mentality of the Assyrians to scatter the people, dislocate them from their hometown, create a diaspora. This is the reason why so many people believe that those 10 tribes completely disappeared from history. The truth is that did not really happen. We have evidence in the Bible that a lot of those Israelites ran away before the Assyrians reached Samaria and found their safety in the kingdom of Judah. We have archaeological and story evidences, narrative evidences in Spain that at least one of those tribes or some remnant from that tribe made it to Spain. Okay? And this is an amazing thing. That is why there is another part of the prophecies in all these 8th century prophets. It's called the gathering, and we will be coming to that. Vision number 4, recorded in chapter 8. This is a bit longer compared to the others. he reverts to this expression, Adonai Yahweh showed me, and he sees a summer fruit basket. Now there's another way of translating the expression here, or a basket full of ripe fruit. Now, if you live in the land of Israel, the main fruits you would have would be grapes, dates, olives, figs, and so on and so forth. Pomegranate. By the way, nutritional science tell us that pomegranates, dates, and figs are superfoods. They're extremely high in nutrients. It's amazing that the land of Israel that God brought Abraham to and Israelites to, those were the three main fruits in the land. Superfoods, high nutritional values. Unlike some of the fruits we have around Southeast Asia, whose nutritional values is a bit lower, but a lot more variety. Like the previous vision, Amos doesn't do anything. He doesn't plead with God, ask for mercy, or anything like that. And then he is told what the judgment will be. This one is a bit more detailed. There are 4 things God says will happen. The ripe fruits represent the fact that Israel is ripe for punishment. Secondly, judgment exists because God does not forget wickedness. Christians like to say that we should forgive and forget. Do you know that idea doesn't exist in the Bible? Forgiveness has nothing to do with amnesia or intentional forgetfulness. In fact, if you forget, you do not forgive. Because forgiveness is about learning to move beyond the evil, beyond the pain, beyond the hurt, or whatever has been done to you. Now, we know that God does not forget wickedness because the Bible tells us he keeps records. There's a record called the Book of Remembrance. There's a record called the Book of Sins, But there is a psalm that kind of looks at it from the other way. It says that if God really judges us by the sins we commit, then none of us can be saved. So why does God not forget wickedness? Because God is being constantly challenged. The few times that you meet Satan in the Old Testament, that's the one thing he's doing. He's challenging God in the Garden of Eden with Job, Joshua, the high priest in Zechariah. Okay, he is challenging God. Who are you? God says Job is good. He says, of course he's good because you favor him. God says Adam and Eve are in his image. He says, no, not really. You have to eat the fruit. God accepts Joshua, the high priest, and Satan says, look at him. He is awful. Excuse me. The third judgment here is an unusual one. God says, I will send a famine in the land, but not a famine for food, a famine for the word. Do you know that the people of Israel, we're talking about totality, but later on, particularly the Jews, it was only in exile that they discovered a love for the Torah, a love for the scriptures. This is an amazing thing that happened. It took captivity, it took diaspora, it took exile for them to wake up and fall in love with their most precious inheritance, the word of God. So God says, I will send a famine. And I don't know what's the hungriest you've ever gotten, but see the famine that's about to unfold in Gaza. But there's a worse one in the Sudan, in Somalia, even worse than Gaza, just that everybody is paying attention to only one place. And then it says that Israel will fall never to rise again. Now, the northern kingdom, unlike Judah, never became a kingdom again. It fell to the Assyrians, 722 BC. It was never rebuilt. It never became a kingdom. Later on, part of it would become the province of Samaria under the Romans. and part of it would become the province of Galilee under the Romans. So by the time we reach Roman times, the land had been divided into three parts: Galilee in the north, Samaria in the middle, and Judea in the south. But Judea is basically the kingdom of Judah intact, even after the exile. So that's a very different history. So Israel will fall, but they will never rise again. So there was never again a kingdom of Israel, because Judah never changed its name to Israel. It's only when the modern nation was established in 1948 that it readopted the name Israel and moved away from the name Judah. Okay, so throughout the post-exilic period, that means from around 539, when Cyrus allowed the Israelites to return, allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem, from that point until the destruction of Judah by the Romans in AD 70, the name Judah, the kingdom of Judah, off and on. It was destroyed a few times, came back to life, destroyed, came back to life. Israel, and that did not happen. The final vision is a rather strange one. This time he does not speak about Adonai Yahweh showing him something. This time he says, I saw Adonai. So this is more from his point of view, not from God's point of view. And he says that God was standing beside, or on the altar. The Hebrew preposition literally means on the altar. The problem is that the altar is always on fire. Okay. And so most English translations have preferred different preposition, standing by the altar or beside the altar. Now, the only altar in reference here would be the altar of the temple in Jerusalem. It was the only living altar. God would not appear in the fake temple in Samaria and Bethel, but definitely in Jerusalem. So whether by this stage Jeremiah was back in Jerusalem, or he was shown, or he had a vision about Jerusalem. So there he sees the temple, sees this altar. Now, most of us don't recognize the temple of Solomon was so big, so high, and the altar was so large that it was equivalent to a two-story building, this altar. It had an entire staircase climbing up to it. It was gigantic. Well, maybe not quite two-story building, more like 1.5-story building. And so anybody who came to the temple, that's what you would see. That altar with the four horns and the fire always, and the smoke rising from it. And of course, there would be always priests around that altar. They're burning sacrifice all the time. And that's where he sees God. Now, did God appear as a human there? He doesn't describe any glory, fire, lightning, and thunder that Isaiah did. And so it's quite possible that maybe God appeared as some priest form, and he recognized. He says that God judges his people and there is no place to hide. Remember what the book of Revelation and the New Testament would say, that when the final judgments of God are launched, people will try to run to the rocks and the caves, also in Isaiah, to find shelter. But when the final judgments arrive, no one can hide from God. And then the prophecy ends with this: Yahweh is his name. You see, the Israelites in the northern kingdom, their main god by the time of Amos was Baal, despite what happened during the time of Elijah, Elisha. They did not change. And so now Amos, this foreigner from Judah, tells them Yahweh is his name. This is the one and only true God. In the epilogue, we have 5 promises that God makes. Now I'm going to pose a question before you, and that is, are these promises physical or spiritual? Were they intended for literal Israel or spiritual Israel? If they were literal, do we see their fulfillment in modern day events with the nation of Israel? Or are they eschatological towards the end times? If God did not fulfill these promises, then why make them in the first place? There's so much questioning right now if the promises God made to Abraham of an eternal land to his descendants, how can we say that God made that promise and did not keep it? So either he was not able to keep it, or he lied to Abraham, or he reneged on his covenant. And all the prophets have similar promises. And these are very interesting in Amos. He lists 5 of them. So after God has done all the judgment, all the judging, and he restores the fortune of his people, this is what will happen. I will never completely destroy the family of Israel. This is why we know that the 10 tribes did not disappear in history as people suppose. You see, sometimes we need to weigh historical, archaeological material with biblical material. You know, we cannot ignore the Bible. And so there are remnants of these 10 tribes all over the world. I believe that the Yemeni Jews, the Ethiopian Jews, the Moroccan Jews, the Egyptian Jews, all of these Jews were part of the so-called lost tribes. They were not just simply the tribe of Judah. In that day, referring to this judgment restoration period, I will restore the fallen house of David. He's almost implying that the so-called kingdom of David will reappear. This is why the Jews have always fought to have their own kingdom, to have their own land. Now, for 2,000 years, they went without it, but now that they have one, they will go to extreme lengths, and I really mean extreme lengths, to try and keep it. Because you need to travel through Israel to understand how Jews feel about the land. You know, all this smoke and mirrors, all this noise around the events in the Middle East right now is based, all those demonstrations in American university campuses, all driven by people who have no concept of what this land means to the people of Israel, to the Jews, who see their modern mission as the recovery of all the lost tribes of Israel. I will bring my exiled people of Israel back from distant lands. This concept is called the gathering. It's one of the most important Old Testament concepts. Now, Seventh-day Adventists get around this concept by spiritualizing it. We say, oh, this applies to the gathering of all the redeemed from all over. But no, because we're talking about 800 years before Jesus appeared in history that the promise was made. And when the Jews returned back from Babylon, they saw the partial fulfillment. When the Hasmonean kingdom was established, they saw partial fulfillment. When the Zionist movement was born, they saw a partial fulfillment. So either this promise is real or it never happened. But here's an even more difficult one. I will firmly plant them there in their own land. We need to read this with the last promise. They will never again be uprooted from the land I have given them. Now, what are we to make of these promises? Because the church has never been promised a land. The church is promised a home. Okay? But the descendants of Abraham, the physical descendants of Abraham, were promised a land. In the book of Joel, there's a very unique prophecy which is having a very different ring in today's world, this year in particular. And it says this: God says that he will judge the nations of the world for 3 sins: for dispersing the people, his people from the land, for persecuting his people, and number 3, for dividing the land. All these, you know, if you read all these attempts at a 2-state solution of the land of Israel, and then read this against the prophecies of Joel, you have a serious problem, a serious theological problem. Did God mean that when he said that he will judge the nations for dividing the land? Because this land is a land that God gave to Israel. It's not a land for the United Nations to give to Israel, or the League of Nations to give to Israel, or the British mandate to give to Israel, all those modern historical movements. It is the land that God gave to Abraham and promised to his descendants forever. Now, throughout the Old Testament, we see God prophesying dispersals from the land, more than one exile. But again and again, there is the gathering, the return. This last one is the most difficult for Christians because you can't spiritualize this. They will never again be uprooted from the land I have given them. And you want to understand the war in Gaza right now? You have to understand some of these Bible prophecies because this is in the mind of the Jews, particularly those so-called right-wing Hasidic Jews uh, who seem so entrenched against any Palestinian ownership of the land. There is a rabbi on YouTube who has a very interesting theory. He says the real contest happening right now is because you have two groups of people descended from two sons of Abraham who are contesting the inheritance. There is only one inheritance God promised Abraham, and that was the land. Interestingly, the land that was promised to Abraham is the entire Middle East as we know it today. All of the countries of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, part of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, these are all part of the land that God promised to Abraham, and parts of Turkey as well. Okay, and so it's a very difficult thing. So has God failed? Were the prophecies just hyperbolic? I don't have an answer for you yet, but studying Amos in the climate of world events right now is very uncomfortable. Because look at these promises. He will bring them back from distant lands. He will plant them in their own land, and they will never be uprooted from the land. A little Bible quiz. Do you know what that land is called in the New Testament? So that should be the Christian name for it. The New Testament simply calls it the land of Israel. In Genesis, when we first meet this land, it had a different name. Canaan, the land, or Canaan in Hebrew, the land of Canaan. Later on, it became known as Israel. Then under the Romans, it became known as Galilee, Samaria, Judea. And after the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Romans decided to rename the province into Syria, Palestina, from which we get the English word Palestine. And then, of course, Israel returned, and now parts of the land is called Israel once again. So the Old Testament and the New Testament are in agreement. This land is the land of Israel. It's the only land that God promised as a permanent and eternal inheritance to Abraham. I'm writing a paper as to why this is so. Why did God choose this particular land? Why did he send his people to Greenland, to Alaska, to the Sahara, or somewhere where there are no people? He sent them to this particular piece of land. When I'm done with the paper, if any of you are interested to see my theory, it's a bit complex paper, let me know. I'll share it with you and you can have a read. And so here are the 5 promises to balance the 5 judgments. The 5 visions are visions of judgment, but the book ends with 5 promises that God makes. And that brings us to the end of our Amos study. You see, the one common thread in all the prophets is this: God pronounces judgment, but the ending of every prophet book is a promise of restoration and redemption. So yes, God is a warrior judge, but he's also the great redeemer. And so the book of Amos is full of judgment from chapter 1 until we get to the epilogue. But in the epilogue, we can breathe free in the promises of God. And the promises are all about restoration. They're all about change of fortunes. The world is promised the same thing. The mess that appeared on this planet as a result of what Adam and Eve did, the mess that came about as a result of the utter depravity of the antediluvian world, the mess that was highlighted in places like Sodom and Gomorrah, the nation of Israel itself, the depravity and degradation of the Canaanites, the wars of history, the modern phenomena like Nazism and the current woke philosophy. All of these things are simply aspects of the judgment. They're all telling us that God is at work. He is turning history. But how does the Bible end? I saw a new heaven and a new earth. But amazingly, just before that statement, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, we see a lake of fire. But that lake of fire, like the fire that Amos saw, would finally purge the land. There is a series of films on Netflix called The Purge. It's a totally different concept. It's extremely violent. It's quite immoral. But the Bible does speak of a final purge because it tells us that when that lake of fire comes on the sinners outside around the city, the New Jerusalem, nothing will be left that is unclean. Nothing will be left that is sinful. And even Satan himself will burn to ash. And the very next thing in chapter 21 of Revelation, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. So many Christians, like Seventh-day Adventists, try to spiritualize these promises in the prophets to say, well, this is talking about the new earth. God is talking about spiritual Israel. By the way, the concept spiritual Israel appears only once in the New Testament, and that is in the book of Romans, in the most difficult chapters of the book of Romans, which has baffled the minds of theologians for 2,000 years, Christian and Jewish theologians. And so we need to consider that perhaps these promises were intended to be fulfilled literally, but that God is slowly working out his plan. What I see is this, that in the experience of Abraham's descendants, the people of Israel, the chosen nation of God, we have a microcosm or a lens through which we can understand the greater work of God, the greater plan of salvation and how that takes place. And so Amos ends with hope, ends with promise. And that is how we should always look forward to the final restoration. For the earth, it means new heavens and a new earth. Individually, it means a place with Christ in his kingdom. For Israel and for history, it means a piece of land designated as an inheritance by God. All of these work in exactly the same way, same formula. All right, let me stop the recording.